The sun sagged low over the prairie, spilling gold across the brittle fields. Wind combed the grasses into long sighs, bending the world under its breath. Two sisters stood by the doorway of a leaning shack, the boards tired and splintering, the chimney slouched like an old man at dusk. They were 19, though hardship had carved a few more winters into their eyes. Julia leaned against the frame, arms crossed tight against her chest, the fabric of her dress worn thin at the elbows. She watched the horizon like it might offer answers. Beside her, Eliza clutched a satchel to her chest, a few mementos bundled inside, a cracked mirror, a scrap of their mother's shawl, a notebook full of small private poems no one had ever read. Behind them, the house sagged silent and still. No laughter lived there anymore, only dust and ghosts. Their mother's grave sat out back, marked by a river stone and a ring of field flowers that Julia tended every Sunday with aching knees. Their father shuffled inside, the bottle slapping heavy against his palm. Once, he had been a man to admire, strong and handsome, voice like a hymn rising over morning dew. But time and sorrow had gnawed the tenderness from him. The whiskey did the rest. The rattle of wagon wheels cut the hush. Dust rose on the road like smoke from a dying fire. Julia's heart hardened in her chest. She knew who came. Eliza edged closer, her fingers brushing Julia's. A silent tether. They had been born together in the same red dawn, 2 breaths apart, and it seemed they would suffer their endings side by side as well. The wagon stopped a few paces from the porch. Harlan Wexley heaved himself down, boots thudding like falling stones. He was a mountain of a man, belly stretching his vest, jowls quivering with each step. His hat was fine, his coat trimmed with gold thread, but there was nothing noble in the man himself. His eyes slid over the girls like they were cattle at market. Their father stumbled out, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, face slack with shame he was too proud to name. He did not look at them. Could not. No words were spoken. Only a handshake, a hard, brutal clasp between men who had lost their way long ago. Harlan's mouth twisted into something meant to be a smile. "Come along, girls. Time we got you settled." Eliza's breath hitched, but Julia squeezed her hand. Not here, not now. Their grief would be private. Their dignity would be the last thing no one could steal. They climbed into the wagon, skirts scraping wood worn smooth by other sorrows. No one said goodbye. The horses snorted and stamped, and the wagon lurched forward. Dust swallowed them whole as they left the only home they had ever known. Julia kept her eyes ahead, chin high, though every jolt of the wagon felt like a hammer to her ribs. She would not look back. She would not give their father that. Eliza, softer, turned once. Her hand pressed against her heart like she could hold the place inside her forever. She watched the shack grow smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a splinter on the edge of the world. The road wound west, ruts deep from years of lonely travelers. The sky bled into twilight, pink and orange bruises across the heavens. Hours passed. The girls did not speak. Words felt too heavy to lift. The land changed as they traveled, the wide openness closing in. Barbed wire fences stitched across the fields. Smoke from distant houses stained the sky black. They crossed a river at nightfall, the waters murky and restless, and Harlan lit a lantern that swung and groaned with each bump of the road. His face, cast in the flickering light, looked like a mask carved from greed and need. He talked as they rode, about his ranch, about the fine clothes they would wear, the parties they would attend. His words were syrupy, but a rot clung underneath. Julia listened in silence, building walls inside her heart. Each promise he made, she marked as a lie. She had learned early not to trust men who smiled without kindness in their eyes. Eliza shivered beside her, pulling her shawl tighter, and Julia slipped an arm around her shoulders, shielding her from the chill that wasn't just the wind. As the night deepened, Harlan's voice slurred. He had a bottle tucked beneath the seat, and he drank with the ease of a man who needed forgetting more than pleasure. The stars overhead wheeled slowly across the black canvas, silent witnesses to the trade made in blood and coin. At the edge of sleep, Julia whispered to Eliza, so soft that only the earth and God could hear. "We are not lost," she said, "only waiting to be found." Eliza pressed her forehead to Julia's shoulder and wept without sound. They camped at a crossroads that night, under a leaning oak that rattled its bare branches like bones. Harlan built a fire, more for himself than for them, and sprawled in his blankets with a grunt. The sisters huddled together beneath a rough canvas, the cold earth stealing their warmth. The fire crackled low. Coyotes called in the distance, their howls slipping through the brittle grass like sorrow made sound. Julia lay awake, her mind spinning tight circles. She counted stars until her vision blurred. She made silent promises, to endure, to protect Eliza, to find a way. Sleep came fitful and thin. At first light, they packed again. Harlan barked orders, his patience as thin as his scruples. The road ahead stretched pale and endless. The sisters climbed back into the wagon, their bodies stiff, their spirits raw but unbroken. A town smudged the horizon by midday, a scattering of buildings stitched together by desperation and dust. Beyond it, Julia saw what she assumed was Harlan's land, a wide, ragged stretch of prairie hemmed in by fencing, a house perched like a bloated spider in the center. Even from a distance, the place felt wrong. Too big, too empty. The horses plodded toward it, heads low. Eliza drew a slow breath and let it out, the sound almost like a prayer. Julia set her jaw. Whatever waited for them behind those walls, they would face it together. The wagon creaked into the yard. No welcome met them, only the slap of the wind against the porch boards. A woman emerged from the shadows of the house, tall, gaunt, wearing black so severe it seemed to leach the color from the air around her. Harlan's sister, Mrs. Langley. Her eyes flickered over Julia and Eliza like measuring cloth. Another trade, unspoken. Another judgment passed without trial. Harlan's laughter broke the moment. He waved toward the house, already bored of his acquisitions. "Get them settled, Langley," he said. "I got business in town." He didn't wait for a reply. He climbed into a second wagon and rattled off toward the saloon, dust trailing like a sinner's veil. Mrs. Langley sniffed, turned on her heel, and disappeared inside. The sisters stood alone in the yard, dust swirling around their boots, the sky stretched wide and pitiless above. Eliza glanced at Julia, her lip trembling, and for a moment Julia saw the little girl she used to be, the one who carried kittens home in her apron and cried when the wind broke the corn. Julia reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tight. Together, they crossed the threshold into the unknown. The door swung shut behind them with a sound like finality, and the prairie wind sang mournfully through the empty yard. The house was a grand thing once, before time and cruelty hollowed it out. Wide verandas sagged under their own weight, shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the smell of rot coiled beneath the perfume of dying roses that clung stubbornly to the front garden fence. Inside, the rooms were large but cold, filled with heavy velvet drapes and furniture that seemed too large for any living soul. The walls wore faded paper, the patterns of flowers and vines curling away as if trying to escape their own decay. Every floorboard whispered complaints underfoot, and the high ceilings trapped the echoes of lost laughter like ghosts no one dared name. Mrs. Langley showed them to a room at the top of a narrow staircase. 2 beds, 2 chipped washbasins, a cracked mirror in a gilded frame that had seen better women and better years. "You'll keep to yourselves," Mrs. Langley said, voice as brittle as winter branches. "You'll be clean. You'll be obedient. You'll be grateful." Then she turned and left without waiting for a reply, the hem of her black dress slicing the air like a blade. Julia set her satchel down by the bed nearest the window. Dust floated in the thin light like tired angels. She looked around the room, taking its measure. 1 door. 1 window. A lock on the outside of the door. Her heart sank, but she did not show it. Eliza crossed the room in small, careful steps, touching the edge of the bed, the cool porcelain of the basin, the worn frame of the window. Each touch seemed to say, "Is this real? Is this all?" Julia busied herself unpacking their few things. It gave her hands something to do, kept the scream trapped behind her teeth from tearing loose. That night, they sat side by side on the bed, staring out the narrow window at a sky smeared with bruised stars. Somewhere out there was the river, the fields, the free wildness they had once known. Here, the world had shrunk to 4 walls and rules spoken in dry, contemptuous tones. Days blurred into each other like watercolor left too long in the rain. Mornings began with Mrs. Langley's sharp knock and a tray of bland porridge. Afternoons were spent sewing, mending, reading dull books from the dusty library, or learning how to walk, speak, and smile as if they belonged to Harlan Wexley's hollow world. They wore fine dresses stitched with lace so delicate it snagged on their calloused fingers. Their hair was brushed and pinned until their scalps burned. Powder dusted their faces until they were pale ghosts of themselves. But beneath the satin and pearls, their spirits coiled tighter each day, waiting for something they could not yet name. Harlan came and went like a storm cloud, sometimes gone for days at a time, sometimes appearing without warning. When he was present, the house became smaller, airless, thick with tension. He would summon them to dinner in the grand hall where a chandelier hung like a rotting carcass over a table set with gleaming silver and plates that tasted of nothing. He watched them eat, his small eyes glinting in the candlelight. His questions were few but heavy, always circling back to ownership, to possession. "You're getting prettier by the day," he said once, wiping grease from his mouth with a silk napkin. "You'll be worth every penny I paid." Julia lowered her gaze and said nothing. Eliza forced a small, tight smile that hurt to see. Afterward, back in their room, they would sit in silence until the numbness wore off, until tears could come and be swallowed back before they gave themselves away. On the fourth Sunday, the first thread of change began to weave itself into their lives. In the kitchens, while fetching tea for Mrs. Langley, Eliza met Ruthie. Ruthie was not young anymore, her hair shot with gray, her hands strong from years of kneading bread and scrubbing pots. But her eyes were kind, and in this place, kindness was a miracle. She pressed a small, wrapped bundle into Eliza's hand. 2 fresh biscuits, still warm. A wink, a touch to her lips for secrecy, and she was gone, slipping back into the shadows. Eliza brought the bundle back to their room like a sacred offering. Julia smiled, for the first time in days, and they ate in greedy silence, savoring the simple grace of it. The next afternoon, Ruthie found Julia in the hallway, pausing as she dusted a vase no one cared about. "You mind yourself, girl," she said, her voice pitched low. "Men like Wexley, they don't buy pretty things unless they aim to break 'em." Julia nodded once, the understanding settling heavy in her gut. Weeks stretched on. Spring tried to creep in at the edges of the land, but here, inside the velvet cage, no seasons changed. Only the sameness of waiting, enduring, breathing quietly enough not to stir the dust of Harlan's moods. One evening, as the sun sagged red and swollen behind the hills, Harlan gathered the girls in the parlor. 2 guests were expected, he said. 2 ranchers. Men of means, of ambition. Good men, he insisted, who would make strong alliances. "You'll be on your best behavior," he said, his voice thick with warning. "Might be you charm one of 'em. Might be you find a new home sooner than you think." His grin was a thing to flinch from, not to answer. After he left, Julia sat by the window, her thoughts running like deer through the tall grass of her mind. Eliza brushed her hair in long, slow strokes, the sound like the whisper of forgotten rivers. "You think it matters how we behave?" Eliza asked at last, voice small and distant. Julia thought of their mother, of how hard she had tried to be good, to be kind, and how it had not spared her from sickness or sorrow. "No," Julia said, staring out at the endless fields. "But we'll survive. We have to survive." Eliza nodded, setting down the brush with trembling fingers. The next morning arrived sharp and clear, the sky a brittle blue. Mrs. Langley outfitted them in their finest dresses, corsets laced so tight their ribs ached, slippers that pinched their toes until tears prickled at the corners of their eyes. They were given gloves, delicate things like spiderwebs, and told to smile but not too wide, to speak but not too much, to exist but not to hope. The hours dragged. The house seemed to hold its breath. When the knock finally came, the sound echoed through every hollow space. Julia and Eliza stood in the parlor, side by side, hands clasped tight behind their backs, hearts hammering like fists against locked doors. The front door swung wide. In stepped 2 men, the dust of the trail still clinging to their coats, their boots heavy with honest earth. Julia's heart stumbled in her chest. The first man was tall and lean, his face carved by sun and wind, a scar running from the corner of his jaw to his throat like a white river. His eyes were pale and steady, like the winter sky before snowfall. Daniel Morgan. The second man was broader, with laughing eyes and a crooked smile, a warmth to him that softened the worn leather of his presence. Silas Morgan. Brothers, by the look of them. Men of the land, not of this crumbling, suffocating house. Mrs. Langley curtsied stiffly. Harlan blustered and boomed his welcome. Julia watched the rancher's eyes, saw the way they scanned the room, assessing, understanding more than they let on. When Daniel's gaze met hers, something shifted. Not a spark. Not a thunderclap. Something quieter, deeper, as if a lock turned somewhere in the hidden parts of herself. Not rescue, she thought fiercely. Not pity. But maybe recognition. Eliza stood frozen beside her, her hand trembling against her skirts. Silas noticed, his smile softening, his posture easing into something open and unthreatening. They were introduced with grand, sweeping words, promises of beauty and virtue laid out like wares in a shop window. Julia and Eliza curtsied low, as expected, but when they rose, they did not lower their eyes. Daniel inclined his head slightly, the barest acknowledgement of equals. Silas's grin widened, as if he saw through the game and chose to play it kindly. The conversation that followed was stilted, Harlan dominating the room with loud boasts and crude laughter. But every so often, Julia caught Daniel watching her with quiet intensity, as if memorizing her the way a man memorizes the shape of the river he must one day cross. The sun dipped lower, slanting gold through the cracked window panes. When the brothers rose to leave, Harlan assured them there would be many opportunities to visit, to discuss business and other prospects. Daniel tipped his hat. His gaze lingered a moment longer than custom allowed, and then he was gone, stepping back into the clean, honest air of the open fields. Julia exhaled slowly, her hands unclenching at last. Eliza turned to her, eyes wide and wondering. Hope, fragile and reckless, began to bloom inside them both. The cage had not been broken. Not yet. But somewhere out there, someone had heard the rattle of their chains. And maybe, just maybe, someone would come back for them. The days after the Rancher brothers' visit stretched long and thin, like taffy pulled until nearly snapping. The house felt different now, thrumming with the knowledge that someone from the outside had seen them, had noticed them. A shift so small it might have gone unseen by most, but for Julia and Eliza, it was a crack in the walls that held them. Mrs. Langley grew sharper, more watchful. Harlan swaggered through the halls with renewed hunger in his eyes, drunk on the idea that his prize might soon be weighed and bought at a higher price. The girls moved carefully, breathing shallow, speaking little, fearing that any wrong step might close the small door that had begun to open. In the mornings, they walked the perimeter of the grounds, skirts whispering against the dry grass, watched always by a stable hand or one of the ranch hands who owed Harlan too many debts to question orders. But the wind carried stories, and it carried hope, and sometimes hope finds its own way into caged hearts. It was Ruthie, ever silent, ever loyal, who slipped a note into Julia's apron pocket one afternoon as she passed the kitchens. No words on the paper, only a place and a time, written in a hand quick and slanted, the old smokehouse after sundown. That evening, after the house settled into uneasy sleep, Julia and Eliza slipped through the shadows, bare feet silent against worn floorboards. The smokehouse sat at the edge of the property, long abandoned, its roof sagging, its walls silvered with age and weather. Inside, the air was thick with the memory of fire and salted meat. A single lantern burned low on the dirt floor, casting trembling shadows against the walls. Daniel stood by the far wall, arms crossed, hat low over his brow. Silas leaned against the doorway, whittling a sliver of wood, his knife flashing in the dim light. Julia's heart stuttered once, then steadied itself. Daniel straightened, his eyes catching hers like a lasso, holding steady. "We don't have much time," he said, voice low, rough as gravel underfoot. Julia nodded, pulling Eliza slightly in front of her, shielding her out of instinct she didn't question. "We heard things," Silas said, tucking his knife away. "About the two of you. About Wexley." He did not say the ugly words, and for that, Julia was grateful. Daniel shifted, the leather of his boots creaking. "We want to help." Simple words. No grand promises. No florid speeches. Just steady, solid truth. Julia's throat tightened. She was so used to men speaking at her, around her, about her, never to her. Never with the kind of quiet respect Daniel's voice carried. "How?" she whispered, voice splintering in the hush. "We're buying cattle from Wexley," Silas said. "Business keeps us close. Gives us reason to come back." Daniel stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "We'll find a way to get you out. When it's safe. When you're ready." Eliza clutched Julia's hand, squeezing so tight it hurt. Julia squeezed back. Ruthie slipped into the smokehouse then, silent as a cat, a bundle under one arm, bread, apples, a flask of water, a small mercy in rough cloth. "I'll cover your tracks best I can," Ruthie said, eyes glinting in the low light. "But you'll need to be smart. Watch. Wait. Listen." Julia felt something stir deep inside her chest. Not hope, not yet. Something harder. Resolve, maybe. Or the stubborn refusal to let their lives end here, in this hollow house. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a small, battered tin. He handed it to Julia, and when she opened it, she found a thin coil of wire, a tiny flint, a folded scrap of map. "Just in case," he said. Silas grinned, soft and boyish. "My brother's a cautious soul. Might be the death of us both someday, but it saved more than a few hides." The lantern sputtered. A reminder that time ran short. Daniel touched the brim of his hat, a gesture full of old-fashioned respect. "We'll be back. Be ready." Julia watched him go, the night swallowing his tall form, the door swinging shut with a whisper. Eliza turned to her, face pale, eyes luminous. "Do you think they mean it?" Julia held the tin close to her chest, feeling its weight, its promise. "I think," she said slowly, "they might be the first ones who ever did." The following days were carved from glass, sharp and delicate. Every movement, every glance, every breath had to be measured. Harlan grew restless, sensing something he could not name. He spent more time at the saloon, drinking and bragging, but his shadow lingered over the house like a thundercloud. Julia and Eliza practiced patience. They memorized the creaks of the floors, the moods of the guards, the patterns of Mrs. Langley's endless inspections. They learned the house the way a prisoner learns a cage, not with despair, but with cold precision. And still, Daniel and Silas returned, always under some business pretense, always careful. Sometimes they would catch a few stolen words in the stable, under the cover of tending horses. Sometimes it was a note slipped between the pages of a book left on a parlor table. Always promises wrapped in caution, in quiet daring. One evening, while Julia brushed Eliza's hair by the window, they spotted movement near the fence line. Two figures, silhouetted against the dying light, tipping their hats in salute before riding off into the deepening dusk. Julia smiled into Eliza's reflection, a rare and precious thing. "They haven't forgotten," she said. Eliza smiled back, tentative but real. Then came the day when Harlan announced a grand gathering, a celebration of new partnerships, he called it. An opportunity to show off his acquisitions, his wealth, his dominion. It would be their chance. Ruthie confirmed it that night, slipping into their room with news carried in whispered urgency. "The brothers are ready," she said. "They'll be waiting by the river, past the old mill. When the clock strikes 11, you slip out. Quiet as sin." Julia's chest tightened around a breath she didn't realize she held. "Are you sure?" she asked. Ruthie's smile was sad and proud all at once. "Girl, I've been sure since the day I first saw you walk into this house with your chin held high. You're not meant for cages." The night of the party dawned hot and thick, the air heavy with the smell of dust and sweat and cheap perfume. Harlan paraded them like trophies, introducing them to men with gold teeth and greedy hands. Julia kept her face serene, her eyes distant. Eliza clung to her side, a porcelain doll with a secret fire hidden beneath her pale cheeks. When the clock in the hallway began its slow, sonorous toll toward 11, Julia nudged Eliza gently. They slipped away under the pretense of fetching more wine, hearts hammering loud enough to rattle the teeth in their heads. Through the kitchens, through the side door, into the blessed, forgiving dark. The grass was wet with evening dew, soaking the hems of their dresses. The world outside the house felt wild and alive, the night full of sounds, crickets, owls, the far-off call of a coyote. They ran. Breathless, laughing a little through the terror, skirts hiked up to their knees, bare feet finding the path by memory and prayer. The old mill loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the silvered sky. And there, waiting by the river, stood Daniel and Silas, their horses tethered nearby, their faces grim and shining with determination. Julia stumbled to a stop, chest heaving. Daniel stepped forward, his hand outstretched, not commanding, not demanding, offering. She took it without hesitation. Silas helped Eliza onto the horse behind him, steadying her gently, speaking soft words Julia couldn't hear. No one said much. There was no need. The river glinted like a sword under the moonlight as they crossed it, the cold water rising to their knees, pulling at their clothes, urging them onward. Behind them, distant and growing fainter, the house sagged into shadow, a place they no longer belonged to. Ahead lay the unknown, rough roads, hard days, danger still, but Julia felt a wild, fierce hope ignite in her chest. Not a fairy tale. Not a rescue. A beginning. They rode hard into the night, dust and stars swirling around them, the future unwritten and waiting, wide as the prairie sky. The stars burned cold above them, scattered like broken glass across a velvet sky. The night smelled of river water and wild grass and the deep, coppery tang of fear. Every hoofbeat was a prayer, every breath a rebellion against the life they had been forced to endure. The river at their backs whispered farewell as they galloped farther into the waiting dark. Julia clung to Daniel's waist, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, the unspoken promise stitched into every careful movement. Eliza rode with Silas, arms wrapped tight around his middle, her face buried in the folds of his worn jacket. She trembled still, from cold or fear or both, but she did not ask to stop. She did not look back. Ahead, the land stretched endless and unknowable, a quilt of prairie and scrub and the occasional gnarled oak reaching claw-like toward the heavens. They rode until the horses foamed and panted, until Julia's legs ached and her hands stiffened with a chill, until even the stars seemed to blur into the blackness. Daniel finally pulled up near a stand of trees, sheltered from the open plain. A small fire was coaxed to life with practiced hands, no brighter than a star fallen to earth. "We'll rest here," Daniel said, voice low, careful not to disturb the fragile safety of the moment. Silas helped Eliza down, murmuring encouragement, his big hand surprisingly gentle as he steadied her shaking limbs. Julia slid to the ground, stumbling slightly before Daniel caught her elbow, a touch light as a feather but strong enough to hold her steady. "Thank you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could weigh them. He only nodded, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. Ruthie's bundle had survived the journey, though the bread was crushed and the apples bruised. They ate in silence, grateful for the sustenance, for the simple fact of still breathing. The fire crackled softly, a heartbeat against the vast hush of the prairie. Julia sat close to Eliza, wrapping her sister in her shawl, feeling the slender bones under the soft fabric, the fragility that lived side by side with the fierce spirit inside her. "You did good," Julia said, brushing a strand of hair from Eliza's face. "You were brave." Eliza managed a small, crooked smile. "I was terrified." "Bravery's not about not being scared," Silas said from across the fire, tossing a twig into the flames. "It's about going anyway." Julia glanced at Daniel, who watched her with that same steady gaze, as if trying to memorize her for all the days to come. Sleep came in fitful pockets. Julia dozed leaning against a tree trunk, waking often to the sounds of restless horses, the whistle of wind through the grass, the soft murmur of Silas and Daniel keeping watch. The dream came like smoke, the old house, her mother's voice calling from somewhere just out of reach, the sharp crack of a door slamming shut. She woke with a gasp, heart pounding, the fire burned low to coals. Daniel was there, sitting a few feet away, whittling a piece of wood into a small, shapeless thing. He did not look at her, did not intrude upon the trembling she could not hide. Instead, he spoke into the space between them, his voice soft as the river's sigh. "You're safe now." Julia closed her eyes against the sudden sting. She wanted to believe him more than anything. The horizon began to bleed with the first pale streaks of dawn, brushing the world in ash and pearl. They saddled up again, moving before the world fully woke. Daniel led them across gullies and ridges, weaving a path no casual pursuer could easily follow. Julia marveled at the way he seemed to know the land by heart, reading the rocks and grasses like a map written in an old, secret tongue. By noon, they reached a low ridge overlooking a stretch of scrubland, broken by a line of cottonwoods and a narrow creek. "This way," Daniel said, urging his horse down the slope. They followed single file, the ground soft and treacherous beneath their mounts. At the creek, they let the horses drink, refilled canteens, and splashed water over their dusty faces. Eliza knelt by the bank, staring at her reflection in the trembling surface. "I don't even recognize myself," she said, her voice breaking like thin ice. "You're not who you were," Julia said gently, crouching beside her. "Neither am I." Eliza turned to her, tears shining in her lashes. "Is that good or bad?" Julia thought of the girl she had been, obedient, quiet, afraid to want more than survival. She thought of the woman she could become, standing on her own feet, speaking her own truths. "Maybe it's just true," she said. "And maybe that's enough for now." A branch cracked sharply in the woods behind them. Silas spun around, hand on his pistol. Daniel rose, eyes narrowing. Out of the trees rode two men, dust-streaked and grim, guns visible at their hips. Wexley's men. Julia felt the blood drain from her face. They had been found. Daniel stepped forward, planting himself between the girls and the threat. "We don't want trouble," he called. "Turn around and go." One of the men spat into the dirt. "Ain't your call, friend. Those girls belong to Harlan Wexley." "Belong to nobody," Daniel said, voice hardening. Silas flanked Daniel, his pistol loose and ready at his side. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a miracle. The sound of more horses, more men. From the ridge above came Sheriff Lawson and two deputies, rifles slung across their saddles. The men cursed and bolted, disappearing into the trees like smoke. Lawson trotted down the slope, nodding at Daniel. "Got your message," he said. "Signed affidavits, witness statements. Harlan's got no legal claim anymore." Relief collapsed Julia's knees, and she sat heavily on a rock, burying her face in her hands. It was over, or as over as it could be. Lawson tipped his hat. "You best get 'em somewhere safe. Wexley won't give up easy." Daniel nodded grimly. "We know." They rode again, moving faster now, the wind in their faces sharp and clean. The land opened up before them, golden fields rolling under a wide, forgiving sky. By sundown, they reached the Morgan Ranch, a modest house of weathered wood and sturdy stone, a barn, a corral, a vegetable patch sprouting brave green shoots. It wasn't grand. It wasn't rich. It was free. Julia slid off the horse and stood staring at it, the lump in her throat too big to swallow. Daniel came up beside her, not touching, just standing near enough for her to feel his warmth. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but it's ours. And you're welcome to make it yours too, if you want." Julia turned to him, saw the truth in his face, the patient, waiting hope. Not a demand. Not a claim. An invitation. Eliza laughed, a sound bright and startling, as Silas showed her the small garden, the goats bleating in their pen. For the first time in what felt like forever, Julia let herself smile. They were safe. They were free. They had survived the night the stars wept. And now, under this vast, forgiving sky, they would learn how to live again. The road ahead would not be easy. Healing never was. But for the first time, the road belonged to them. They would walk it, stumble on it, dance upon it, side by side with the men who had seen them not as broken things to possess, but as whole souls worth standing with. Night fell slow and soft, wrapping the ranch in cool arms. From the porch, Julia watched the last light fade, Daniel's dog snoring softly by her feet, Eliza's laughter drifting from the kitchen. Daniel joined her, leaning against the post. Neither spoke. Words weren't always needed. The stars blinked awake overhead, scattered and brave. Julia tilted her face up to them, feeling the cool breath of the universe against her skin. "We're not what they tried to make us," she whispered. Daniel's hand brushed hers, featherlight, steady. "No," he said. "You're something far greater." She believed him. And for the first time, she believed herself too. The stars wept again that night, but this time it was with joy. The days that followed fell into a rhythm both foreign and comforting, a melody the girls had never dared imagine for themselves. The ranch woke early with the rooster's call, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread curling through the air like a soft hand coaxing them from sleep. Julia took to the work naturally, her hands strong and willing. She mended fences, gathered eggs, learned the stubborn ways of the mule Daniel favored for plowing. Each small victory stitched a new piece of herself into being, the rough places inside her smoothing with every honest day's labor. Eliza thrived among the gentler corners of the ranch, tending the garden, reading aloud from battered books on the porch, singing soft songs that floated on the breeze like wildflowers scattered by an unseen hand. Her laughter, once buried deep beneath fear, came easier now, surprising her as much as anyone. Daniel and Silas never crowded them, never claimed them. They worked alongside, shoulder to shoulder, offering guidance where needed but trusting the girls to find their own ways, their own strength. It was Daniel's steadiness that Julia felt most acutely. He was not a man of many words, but the ones he offered were sure and weighty, falling between them like stones building a bridge. When Julia faltered, unsure if she could ever fully shed the skin of the girl who had been sold like cattle, Daniel would simply nod at her and say, "One step at a time, Julia. You're already walking farther than you know." And so she did. One evening, as the sun melted into a sky streaked with gold and lavender, Julia found herself standing in the field beyond the barn, a halter in her hands and a stubborn wide-eyed colt staring back at her. She had spent 3 days trying to gentle him, trying to earn his trust, and he had met every advance with suspicion and flight. Daniel leaned against the fence nearby, watching but not interfering. Julia moved slow, speaking in the soft, coaxing tones Ruthie had once used to calm the skittish kitchen cats. Inch by inch, she approached, her hands open, her heart steady. The colt snorted, tossing his head, but when she did not retreat, he stepped forward, wary but willing. Her fingers brushed his nose, warm and trembling. "You're safe now," she whispered, not just to him but to herself. Daniel's voice drifted across the field, low and proud. "Knew you had it in you." Julia turned, the colt's halter looped easily around her wrist, and smiled at Daniel, a smile full of new beginnings. As the days warmed into the heart of summer, the ranch buzzed with preparations for the harvest festival in town, a gathering that promised music, trading, and the simple joy of community. It was Silas who first suggested they go. "You girls have earned a night of dancing and pie," he said, winking at Eliza, who flushed and laughed in a way that made Silas look like he had just been handed the world. Julia hesitated, old instincts warning her against too much attention, too much hope. But Daniel met her gaze across the dinner table, silent encouragement in the tilt of his head, the slow curl of his hand around his coffee cup. Maybe it was time. The night of the festival, the town square bloomed with lanterns strung between buildings, their light painting the dusty streets in pools of amber and rose. Fiddles sang, boots stomped, and laughter filled the air like rain after a long drought. Julia wore a dress Ruthie had once helped her sew, simple, blue as twilight, with a ribbon at the waist. Eliza, in soft green, looked like something out of a dream, her hair braided with small wildflowers Silas had gathered along the creek. Daniel offered his arm to Julia without a word, and she took it, her hand settling into the crook of his elbow like it had always belonged there. They danced slowly at first, Julia stiff with nerves, Daniel patient and solid, letting her find the rhythm on her own. "You're doing fine," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. Around them, the world blurred into light and sound, the sharp edges softened by joy. Eliza laughed as Silas spun her too fast, nearly tipping her into the hay-strewn street, and even Mrs. Turner from the Mercantile clapped along, her usually stern face creased with smiles. For one night, there was no past heavy on their shoulders, no fear lurking in the corners of their minds. There was only the dance, the stars overhead, the music in their blood. Later, after the last notes faded and the last lantern sputtered out, Daniel led Julia to the edge of the square where the prairie breathed against the darkness. They stood side by side, watching the distant fields ripple under the rising moon. "I never thought I'd have this," Julia said quietly, her voice raw with wonder. "A home. A life." Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He fumbled it open, revealing a thin band of silver, plain and beautiful, shaped by a craftsman who understood that strength lies in simplicity. He didn't kneel, didn't make a grand speech. He simply held it out, his hand steady. "Not because you owe me anything," he said, his voice rough. "Not because I saved you. Just because I'd be proud to walk beside you for the rest of my days. If you'll have me." Julia felt her heart, so long locked behind walls of fear and survival, shatter and rebuild itself in a single breath. She took the ring, her fingers brushing his, and slid it onto her own hand without hesitation. "I'd be proud too," she said, smiling through tears that tasted like freedom. Silas proposed to Eliza 3 days later with a crooked daisy chain and a promise to never let a day pass without making her laugh. She accepted between peals of laughter and the happiest tears Julia had ever seen. The weddings were simple affairs held in the meadow behind the ranch, daisies and cornflowers braided into garlands, Ruthie standing proudly beside them with a handkerchief pressed to her nose. Sheriff Lawson officiated, his usual sternness softened by the genuine affection he felt for the four of them, survivors and dreamers alike. Daniel and Julia exchanged vows under the wide, forgiving sky, the golden field swaying around them like an ocean of possibility. There were no fancy words, no grand adulations, just promises spoken plain and true, to stand together, to build something better, to heal at their own pace. The rings slid into place like they had been waiting for this moment all their lives. Afterward, there was dancing in the barn, the old floorboards trembling under the stomping of boots and the swirl of skirts. Eliza's laughter rang bright and clear, a music more precious than any fiddle tune. Silas beamed at her like a man who had caught a falling star and dared to hold it gently in his hands. And Daniel, ever steady, ever true, held Julia close as they swayed to the slow songs, his chin resting against her temple, their hearts beating a quiet, steady rhythm of belonging. Later, as the festivities died down and the lanterns winked out one by one, Daniel led Julia to the porch where the night stretched wide and welcoming before them. They sat together in the old rocking chair, her legs tucked beneath her, his arm draped around her shoulders. For a long time they said nothing, content to listen to the night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the low murmur of the creek, the occasional soft whinny of a horse in the corral. Finally, Julia turned her face up to the stars, bright and endless above them. "Do you think it's possible," she asked softly, "to be broken and whole at the same time?" Daniel considered this, his thumb tracing slow circles against her arm. "I think," he said, "that being broken just means you've lived. And being whole means you kept going anyway." She smiled, a slow, blossoming thing that filled her chest with warmth. "Then we're doing just fine," she said. He kissed her hair, a whisper of a promise. Tomorrow would come with its share of trials, droughts and debts and the hard, honest work of building a life from the ground up. But tonight, they had everything they needed. Love, steady and fierce. Hope, stubborn and shining. A future carved from fields of gold under a tomorrow's sky. Julia closed her eyes and let the wind carry her forward, into the life she had fought for, the life she had chosen. And somewhere, she swore she could hear the stars singing, weeping no longer, but rejoicing at last.